where I first heard about it, they had almost 100 people because it was, but there's a good side and a bad side, like down to that one and then one online.
We'll have like, I don't know.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Yvonne Denome, and I'm the Title I manager. And it is 7 o'clock, and for those of you that know me, you know that I like to start on time and end on time. We appreciate you coming out and taking time away from your family, and that is the least we can do is to honor your time for being here this evening. Just some Title I expectations for many of you that have attended. These are the expectations for Title I schools is to conduct outreach, to engage parents and families in Title I programs, to engage in meaningful consultation with parents of participating children, and to maintain a written parent and family engagement policy. Your participation in TPAC helps us meet all of those previous requirements. We know that our role specifically is to increase your involvement in planning and implementation of federal compliance and interest within the committee to strengthen local partnerships, to develop leadership and advocacy skills, and respond to the charge from the school board in an annual report. TPAC is a school board appointed citizens advisory committee. So the end of every May, there is a school board, there's a report that the executive board of TPAC helps write with your input, and then that is presented the last Wednesday of May each year. So before we get started this evening, I would like to recognize one of our Title I principals in the room. Would you mind introducing yourself and sharing a little bit?
Sure, I'm Cecilia Vanderheim. I'm the principal of Belvedere Elementary School. And can I share? I've been the principal there. This is my 9th year, and we are the only authorized Title I primary years program school in the county. Actually, the only authorized primary years program school. So it's an IB school for the elementary.
Very good. Thank you so much. So this evening, we're going to continue our topic around trauma-informed. Last month at our meeting, we had the pleasure of viewing the Resilience film. And for me, I had heard a lot about it, but I had not seen it myself. And what a powerful film. And then the conversation that followed the film was also very enlightening and very powerful, to be able to not only see the film, but to see it from the lens of the parents viewing it and hearing the comments and the feedback from that parent perspective. So that was very powerful. So what I am looking forward to this evening, we have a guest speaker, and at the end of the evening, you're going to have about 15 minutes to talk at your table, and then in your packets on your table, there will be Post-it notes. And at the end of the evening, we're going to ask you to reflect that following discussion and learning about the information this evening, what might your next actions be to build the capacity of your community around the topic of trauma? All right. We're going to ask that on your way out that you set, good evening, that you set your Post-its on the table were the sign-in sheets. The information that we compiled this evening will be incorporated into the TPAC School Board report that we're going to start working on early at the beginning of next month at our TPAC Executive Board meeting. All right? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our guest speaker, and this is Ms. Jenna White. And I'm going to let her introduce herself because she has a plethora of titles that I believe you'll find fascinating.
Yeah. They're all really kind of one title. You know, in PTA, you do many jobs, and they just give you lots of different titles. But I actually just I just got here from Baltimore. It sounds like the start of a bad joke, but I just went to the Creating Trauma Sensitive Schools Conference in Atlanta, Georgia, for 3 days. The conference is in its third year. The first year was here the last 2 years it was here in DC, and so it was really easy to go. First year it had 400 people. Last year it had 800 people, and then it had such demand that they decided to move from here in DC to Atlanta so they could accommodate more people. This year it sold out at 1,700 people. So it was so amazing to be in this long, huge, skinny ballroom, just full, cavernous, just full of people, people from South Africa, from England, Canada, every state, Alaska, Hawaii. Virginia had a group of a lot of people from Southern Virginia through their CSB. They ended up getting some funding. I'm going to pass around the program. Like I said, it was 3 days. Every session had I think about 10 workshops to choose from. So the breadth of topics, there was a session on poverty, there was a session that I wasn't able to go to, and I actually spoke and did one of the sessions on working with parents and family engagement. So that was really exciting to try to have that parent voice come into it. So I have tried to modify this presentation quite a bit since hopefully most of you did get opportunity to see resilience and then to really focus on equity. So if I'm looking at my own slides, it's because just I've changed the order. Are you able to do the preview mode or no?
No.
Okay, because of course now my computer's not working. So we're going to start with the video, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of these roles as we go, but I did want to mention we are solely Title I schools here in Fairfax County. I have a big age difference in my kids. My oldest went through Bailey's and Belvedere a long time ago, and he graduated from Justice in 2016. Went through all the name change fun for years and years and years, and now my youngest went to Sleepy Hollow, and now he's at Glasgow. So we're going to watch a quick video. I think it's about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll jump into the rest of the presentation. Actually, so if it takes a second for it to load, I'll just mention one of the key roles is we have something called the Trauma Informed Community Network here in Fairfax County, and there's actually now 23 other communities in Virginia that have the same Trauma Informed Community Network. So it's run through the Department of Neighborhood and Community Services, and it's all of the county agencies, so housing, juvenile justice, family services, early intervention, and then SCPS. And then when I learned about it, I went to the FCC PTA and asked if they would create a position so that I could be the liaison to the Trauma Informed Community Network, and that's been about 2 years now.
Mr. Hill, did you see that? Why would somebody do that?
Please go into the classroom, no talking, quietly.
Candace, we're not Taiwan.
We need you inside.
How do you think that makes us feel? I forgot my number.
What's your name?
Jordan?
What's your last name?
Carter?
Go ahead.
School is hard enough.
Come on in, sit down quietly at your desk, and begin writing.
This kind of stuff just makes it harder.
I said quietly, please. Who's talking? Is it you, Sophie? Don't let me be you.
Don't believe me?
Sophie.
Please just watch. I'm not up here for me, I'm up here for you. Pay attention, okay? Now, somebody answer me. Somebody needs to answer me really fast. Every time we're ignored or yelled at or silenced, the teacher takes away what's possible.
No horseplay, no running, and especially no talking.
Moment by moment.
Mr. Garrity, your student's behavior yesterday in the lunchroom, it was terrible. Next time.
Did you hear that? Stay in line and catch a bubble. I'm not playing.
If this is education, we're in trouble. Bye, Miss McGarrity. Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you'll be forever free. The way it is now, 2 of the 3 of us will never be able to really read. It doesn't have to be this way.
Hey, Jordan, how you doing? Good.
Everyone we meet throughout our day can make a difference.
I've been waiting for you to arrive.
All the difference.
Good, how are you? Great. Hi, Jordan. Bye, Jason.
Good morning, Jordan.
How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. How are you?
Good.
Go ahead and put your number in.
Oh, what's this? Not S.
That's okay. I'll look it up for you. Go ahead, sweetheart.
Okay.
All right.
Teach us what we need to know. That's how we get smarter.
Well, good morning, Sophie, Janicia, and Jordan.
And when you talk with us and teach us, give us bigger and bigger words.
Now what I'd like you to do, children, is turn around and converse with your neighbor and discuss where the mother might have gone.
Words that we can use to read and understand.
She's praying for evil, so she comes at night.
Take us places we could never reach without you.
Remember, we're entering the learning zone. Now, how can we show our respect to the children and teachers who are working?
We can walk quietly.
Yes. Okay, kids, so what I'd like you to do is continue writing your narrative, documenting your emotions if you were a baby owl and your mother abandoned you in the nest.
What can you do? Learn all that you can so that you can challenge us to be our best.
You would have stayed and assisted them in whatever they needed.
Share yourself with us and show us how to share ourselves with others. Give us courage. Give us compassion. Help us find our own voices so we can become who we are meant to be. Why would you want to silence us?
So this video, in a sense, is kind of everything that you need to know about being trauma informed. I don't know if you caught it, but they talk about literacy several times. This is actually done by a literacy group. But what I love about it is, we don't know which of those students may or may not have trauma, right? We don't know which of them may have ACEs scores. But the second version of school, it really illustrates the point so beautifully. This is what we want for all children. So the takeaway is it's essential for children that do have trauma because of the impact on their brain development. But that's really what it's all about, what we want for all students. And so I love the comparison and contrast, because who would want to go to the first school and who would want to work in the first school? So much of this is really about support for teachers and the relationship, support that teachers have, which of course starts from the principal and from their leadership. And I don't think any of us would want to be in an atmosphere like that first school, and you can see the impact on the kids. So just quickly, wanted to go into sort of the background of why I got so involved with this. So this is my youngest son, and right from out of the bat, right out the gate, he had a lot of issues. He was having developmental problems, he was having sleeplessness, he was referred to early childhood intervention. We started seeing all of these professionals. So years went by, he got his, he switched over to IEP, to FCPS, which Alpine. IEP booklet, started growing and growing. The diagnoses started collecting, but he was really still in crisis year after year. He still wasn't sleeping. He was falling further and further behind. His behavior was really, really out of control. And I was really proactive. I knew a lot about mental health and development, but nothing was really fully helping. And I was like, something is missing, something is still wrong here, and nobody could really figure it out. So, I deleted, okay, I deleted one of the slides. Then I went to, in around 2012, I went to the Fairfax County Mental Health Conference, as I had gone to many years, and I was looking at the sessions, and I was like, I've already been to most of these sessions. And there was one on developmental trauma, and I thought, well, that doesn't really apply to us. But then when I read the description and it talked about some ongoing chronic sorts of environments and the impact that can have on very young children, I thought, well, maybe I do need to actually learn about this. So I went to the session, learned everything that was in resilience, and learned that everything that I thought about trauma was wrong, and it turns out that was the thing that was missing this whole time. So on the left, some of the things that I thought, or I never had really thought about it at all, but the stereotypical, trauma is that one-time thing. If you're in a natural disaster or a car accident, or if you're a war vet, that's what I thought it was. Thought about it in terms of adults. I never really had thought about it in terms of kids. And one of the biggest stereotypes is that the younger the child, the less likely they are to remember, right? So it doesn't really affect them. Wrong. And that is something really rare. It's very sort of extreme. You don't encounter it very often. And that's really just more of an emotional issue that you can work through verbally and emotionally. And so then, of course, all of those things are wrong. And it was the exact opposite. So the things I started learning that day was not just that single event, but it's those ongoing chronic or acute trauma or systemic forms of trauma. And in fact, the younger the child, the bigger the impact on the brain. So again, just the opposite. That trauma can very easily look like many other things and can be very easily misdiagnosed. And then things like witnessing domestic violence, the younger the child, the more severe the impact. There's been a lot of studies on this. One of those videos that goes around in the other room sleeping, and two older kids, and the police come and they follow these children, and it was the baby asleep in the other room that showed the most severe impacts several years later out of those siblings. And then in terms of occurrence, it's actually extremely common. There's lots of numbers out there, but generally accepted is that it's 1 in 4 children. And then that it's really not an emotional issue, it's a physiological issue, right? It's not something that people can just come up and start talking about or working through emotionally. So again, just sort of to summarize, this is what we talk about with types of trauma. Actually, let me back up. So when I learned those things that day, I was relieved in one sense because now we had sort of a path to get the help that we needed and for me to understand how to better relate with my son and help him. But at the same time, I was really angry because we went to all these people, all these professionals, and nobody had mentioned trauma. And the thing was, they ask you all these questions, and I answered all the questions. And they write it up and they put it in the report. And they say, oh, that sounds stressful, but let's go on and talk about medication or talk about this or referrals and this and that. They never really said, let's look at the impact of these things on your son. And I'm like, if I'm going to the professionals and they're not telling me this, we ended up wasting years and years and years while, like I said, my son was falling further behind. So just like any parent, when you find out your child has a medical diagnosis, and the kids, it usually starts with something similar where you get really fired up about something. And so that's what has gotten me so involved. It set me on a course of just learning everything I could about childhood trauma, about developmental trauma, and then becoming more involved in terms of, I just felt like I really wanted other parents to know about this because it could be happening to children that they know. After most of the presentations, people will come up and say, this is my niece, or this is my godson, or this is my child's best friend, or these are the kids in our classroom, because we know how common it is. So along the way, I started working with my son's school, starting with his IEP, which was already well underway, and trying to get them to understand what was going on with him, why his brain worked the way it did, how it was impeding his learning, and then all of the things I learned that could help him be available to learn. And as I started learning those things and working with his teachers, with his IEP team, with the principal, it's like, wow, these are things that everybody really needs to know. These are tremendous, this is tremendous, powerful information that will really make a difference for all of our kids. So I mentioned the Trauma Informed Community Network. They have a Trauma 101 presentation that they have been doing for years. And one of your handouts has a summary of that. Here at the top, you can, one of the columns is the tick-in. So I took the Trauma 101 presentation, and that's sort of the foundation of a lot of this material, and with their help, started modifying it and making it more school specific, because that was very general, for a very broad audience, and then just adding my own personal experiences and then the things that I was finding along the way. So been doing this presentation primarily through PTA settings, and then trying to get it into individual schools through the PTA. And it was actually, the reason I'm here now is because I met with Karen about 2 years ago and talked to her, and she said, you need to talk to TPAC. And I was like, T who? And she was like, talk to Mike. So started talking to Mike. Turns out our kids go to the same school now. So we've been talking about this for the past few years, and I'm very excited that I finally have this opportunity to share this information with you. So the sort of the 101 part, I'm going to go through really quickly because again, the resilience part covers that. How many of you were able to see resilience the last time? And just wanted to put in a plug that is something that's available for your schools, either through your PTA or through your school itself, and that's something that we can help you set up, or you can talk to your school social worker, and they facilitate that at your school, again, to really try to get this information out into the community.
I just want to interject here that I was asked if I was making sure folks had handouts. If you were going to get a copy of PowerPoint this evening, you will get the PowerPoint electronically. Given that the video is embedded, I didn't want to send you a PDF because it wasn't going to give you access to the video. So tomorrow morning, each of you are going to receive an email from me with the recording, with the PowerPoint, and the handouts in electronic format, because Jenna has graciously ensured that the links on the handouts are live. So that will be a huge tool for you as you are providing support in your community. And then the last thing that I might interject, I'd like to introduce you to our school board members. I'll let her introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Good evening, everybody. I'm Karen Keys-Gamara. I'm one of your at-large school board members, and I have had the pleasure of being on for this committee for the last couple of years. And I want you to know that I brag on you on a regular basis, and I don't take any argument for it. So I just think you guys are doing amazing work, and we're just so grateful that you are helping us to really get information out to all of our Title I schools. So thank you so much. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you. So we've already talked about this, very common, 1 in 4 children, Voices for Virginia's Children. They just came out with a new graphic at 20%. But if you think about 1 in 4 students, we have, 187,000 students in Fairfax County. So 25% of that, you're looking at 25 to 30,000 students that are likely impacted by childhood trauma. And then in resilience, they talked about ACEs. That's another way to measure adversity. That was a public health study. If you saw the movie, Dr. Anda was in it. He was the keynote speaker at the conference, so I got to hear him speak. Didn't get a selfie because the line was like around the building and it was 10 o'clock at night. But from the original ACE study, that has been expanded and adopted. So in Virginia, we have been doing an expanded ACE study called the BRFIS, Real Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And so this tells you, breakdown, basically, they look at 10 things, 0 to 10. The higher your ACE score, the more adversity you've experienced. And what you see here in Virginia in the upper right-hand corner is pretty similar to what the original ACE study found in the 1990s. They found about 30%, only 30% had no ACEs. So about 70%, we're at about closer to 60% have no ACEs, but then of course that means, 40% do not have an ACE, then that means 60% have 1 or more. But what I really wanted to highlight for this group specifically is then ACEs by race, ACEs by income. And I think you really have to be careful. I want to back up because I skipped over something. This is really important, the outer ring. There's a lot of work being done now, a lot of studies on systemic trauma. So poverty can be a form of systemic trauma. Racism can be a form of systemic trauma. There's a lot of other mitigating factors that go into determining how an individual child experiences that, and we'll talk about it, but it's really important that we think about things from that lens, right? And all of the work we're doing with equity and One Fairfax, we need to make sure that we're also looking at it in terms of what we know or what we're learning about trauma, what we're learning about ACEs. And that's something that, from the things that I've been able to do with the equity conversations with the equity folks, I'm not hearing enough conversation about this information, about this data. So that's where, obviously for your group, I think there's that intersection piece, right? And so then when we look at the breakdown, it's really nuanced, because on one hand, it's really important that we do understand the impact of poverty and systemic forms of trauma, but at the same time, we have to be really careful that we don't take that too far, right? Because we can see too that ACEs are common. So it's certainly something that we need to understand the role of poverty, but at the same time, this is not purely a poor people's problem. They say, so money does not make you immune to ACEs or to adversity. We know this is common across socioeconomic status, and these numbers certainly bear that out, especially when you look at the 4 or more category and you see whites are actually higher than blacks and just very close with other and Hispanic category. And then same thing with income, like you just said. So gated communities, in those communities, there might be more of the denial, but we know that's just not true, that again, money does not protect you from these sorts of things. And so here in Fairfax County, we have sort of both ends, right? We need to make sure that this is something being addressed from an equity lens, but at the same time, we need to make sure that it's something that all of our schools are looking at, because it's not just in our Title I schools. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask on the ACEs by income status. Your y-axis there, is that, so are those quartiles?
This?
No, on your left. Yeah.
This is income, so less than 25,000 a year.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this obviously was from 2017, which is the latest information that we have. And this, it looked like it didn't go through. There was a picture of Mr. Rogers, right? So Mr. Rogers is back. A lot of this is really going back to what I've been saying for decades, right? The Boys Town, where they go out and work with the horses. We know now that that's one of the most effective treatments for trauma. But Mr. Rogers had a great quote that we've been using. Anything that's human is mentionable. Anything that's mentionable can be more manageable. So one of the first things when I started getting really involved with this was I started looking at private programs for my son. At one point, we were looking at even considering residential programs for him. So as I started learning about trauma-informed and seeing how a lot of other programs were talking about the ways that they were trauma-informed, I was looking at things being put out by Fairfax County and not seeing that same language. So I started asking about it and saying, so if it was a specific program, when you go to the conference and each department has nice booths and staff and different things, I said, well, would you say that this is trauma-informed? They were like, social worker? I'm like, no, I'm a parent. They're like, are you a social worker? It's like, no, this is, my life now. This is what I've learned. This is my job. This is obviously where kids leave school and, they come home for the rest of the day. And so I'm not sure if it was more clinical information. And this was several years ago. And now there's so much more public awareness and it's growing so much. But one of the points that I want to make is to make sure that we figure out how to talk about this, right? And obviously we do have to do it thoughtfully, right? Especially when we're talking about things like poverty with parents, when you're talking about children who are experiencing abuse or neglect or household dysfunction. Yes, we need to be thoughtful about it, but we don't need to avoid it altogether, because if we do, we're doing a disservice, mainly to our kids and to our staff, because as parents, we need to make sure that we're engaged in this, right? And we can be advocating for our teachers and for our principals to make sure that they have the things that they need. We're going to talk a little bit about what makes a school trauma-informed. And that was a big, at the conference I just went to, Dr. Anda talks a lot about the power of people who are impacted by ACEs are the ones that need to be involved in their own healing, right? They don't need somebody to come in and say, here's your program, good luck, right? They need to be the ones to say, this is my own course to healing. And it's the same thing with parents, especially parents who've been affected by ACEs. We are the ones who need to be saying, this is what we want for our schools and for our children. And then again, I put this in, what's in a name? You know, the trauma-informed name, we could talk about that for a long time. Other schools, Washington State has revised their entire statewide system of education around what they call compassionate schools. Some places call it whole child or community schools. Again, when you think back to that video, right, when you think of the second school you call it, is it trauma-informed? Well, definitely it checks the box. I mean, it would be great if we just called that school, right? If we just called this being a good school.
Right.
I've seen articles come out that say, instead of trauma-informed, why can't we call this human-informed? Because it's just understanding everybody's brain is different based on their experience. Educators need to understand how our brains work, how that impacts learning, and then really it all starts with the approach of empathy and building relationships, right? We know that relationships are the key. So I just wanted to kind of put that in there, and I talked with other people or other parent leaders, and they're like, well, I don't like the name. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really like the name either, but I'm not really the one who gets to pick what we're going to call it. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out there because, you know, in a lot of schools are doing this work. At Glasgow, they're doing tremendous work. They don't ever call it trauma-informed. When I ask them why, they're like, I don't know, we call it PBIS because we started with the PBIS framework. And really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because the children's experience is so wonderful there because of what they've built. But this is something to think about and hopefully talk about as we go on. Put this in here really more better for you guys to review, especially if you didn't see resilience, but really looking at, so the brain architecture, neural pathways, your hormones, even at your cellular level, and then things like your immune system and your nervous system. So it's really, physiological, not emotional, and it's a head-to-toe effect. And the younger the child, the greater the effect, of course, right, because we know how tender and how vulnerable a developing child is. And then really, let's see what order I put this in. Really the biggest takeaway for trauma-informed, if you were to say, what does it mean? It just really means understanding behavior, right? This is what the special ed community has been saying forever. And a lot of the trauma-informed work started with parents of adopted and foster children. So for decades, they started getting these kids from the orphanages. And that's, of course, how we learned a lot of this, right? You would never do a study where you would intentionally do these things, but we have all these children who were neglected or abused or grew up in total deprivation for years and then came over as adopted children, and then clinicians studying them and understanding the impact that has on them. So really when you look at sort of the path to behavior, the thought process should be, and again, this is really a general look, so it's incorporating trauma, but it goes beyond that to encompass all children. So what's sort of the basic, is there a basic human need underlying it, right? So do they just not have breakfast, right? We know all about that, the importance of, do they have something to eat? Do they need a washing machine for their clothes? Do they need their toothbrush? What are their basic physical needs or their basic human needs? So this is, when you see a behavior, what should your thought process be? Is it a developmental stage? So if a 2-year-old is exhibiting certain behavior, maybe it's because they're 2 years old, and that's what 2-year-olds do. Then you would look at sort of what's the current state of the nervous system, right? Because we all have responses to stress. Levels rise. We all have the same physiological responses. So you could say, is the child just nervous or stressed out? Are they under stress? But then going beyond that, is it someone who's in that elevated state where their stress response system has been hijacked? It's always up here, it's always running. Then you're looking at, are they in fight, flight, or freeze? So that's when you would put sort of that trauma lens on it. So maybe you've ruled out these other things, and maybe you would need to consider that. Is that what you're dealing with that child? And then even with that, there's still the context of, even given all those things, this is where the individual response comes in. Maybe that child has learned some coping strategies or some skills. So maybe even though they have experienced a lot of trauma, it's not going to manifest itself in every child, and it's not their destiny, right? Because individual children have learned different strategies to deal with it. And then going back to structural changes, thinking and conditioning, but then really ending up with how is the problem, or how is what the child is doing really their solution, right? So if they don't feel safe, what doesn't make sense to us is their body trying to keep them safe. And just because we don't understand the trigger doesn't mean that it's not very valid to them. So really it's just looking a long process to say, let's look beyond the behavior. So this is similar. All behavior is communication. Again, that's really one of the mantras. If you don't know how to explain trauma informed, you could just say all behavior is communication. This is a great graphic you can look at as well. There's many versions of this with the iceberg. So behavior is what you see at the top, and then all of the things underneath that could be that are influencing the child's behavior. And so then this is the other great phrase that sort of sums it up. And this is something that, especially with the ACE interface presentation, and Dr. Anda talks about a lot, is really that compassion. And if you are trauma informed and have that lens, you understand how these things impact people. When you see things, especially difficult behaviors, because this stuff is not pretty when you see it in reality. I mean, these are the kids that you're like, whew, let me go somewhere else. It's some hard stuff to be around, but when we see those behaviors, what do we often think? Automatically, right? What is wrong with you? And that's how we think of other adults too, right? When they cut us off in the garage when we leave tonight, what's wrong with you? But especially when it comes to these kids, if we are trauma informed, that simply means that we change our mindset from what is wrong with you to what happened to you, right? So maybe, and we don't even, again, we don't have to know. It doesn't mean you have to find out, or that teachers have to know, or that we have to have everything all spelled out. By simply having that mindset is going to change the way you interact with that child. It's going to change you from being in that scene of the school to being more of a scene 2 sort of school, just by having this mindset. So there's a lot of research on the impact of trauma. So everything, GPA, test scores, graduation rates, dropouts, attendance, and then of course behavior. So suspensions, expulsions, time out of the classroom. I didn't put the numbers on here, but it's all there. If somebody wants to validate it, I can point you to the information. But it's dramatic. In some cases, it can be high as 8 times more of a child who's experienced trauma as opposed to someone who hasn't. And then the other thing that I always like to point out, and this is a huge area that's constantly being looked at, is it ADHD or is it trauma? Because when you start thinking about the impacts of trauma on executive functioning, what does that look like? What do people with executive functioning problems look like, and what do they get diagnosed as? ADHD. What happens when they get the ADHD diagnosis? They get medicine, right? Yeah. So then what happens when the medicine doesn't work? Now the teachers and the parents are really in a jam because everyone, the doctor or whoever has told them, here's your medicine, here's your prescription, and now the child's not getting any better. So the child is still exhibiting those behaviors, and everybody's saying, why aren't you fixed? Why didn't this pill fix you? We're not asking the right questions. We're not looking beneath the surface. This article in The Atlantic does a great job. It's a very in-depth article. So one of my other presentations, I call it Bringing Trauma to School, because this is what you end up with, right? We know that the teachers are the front lines. Everything that's really happening in our society, the children take it all in. They can't just leave it aside as they walk in the door in the morning, right? So their backpack is full of all of these very difficult things. And then what happens, right? This is a hugely important part of the trauma-informed movement, is the impact on teachers and secondary trauma or compassion fatigue, right? Because the teachers are, they're experiencing all of this, they're having to unload all of this, they're absorbing all of this, and they're trying to teach and do the rest of their job. So when you look at things like teacher retention rates, right, or even just right now, we know we have a huge crisis in our teacher pipeline. There are not enough teachers coming down the pike that are enrolling in this professional programs and college programs. We have shortages with substitutes. We have all kinds of things. So this is really, again, how do we support teachers? How do we meet their needs? There was a YouTube video that came out like maybe 2 months ago about mental health for teachers, a beautiful young teacher from the South with a wonderful, fun accent, and she talks about how that affects her and how she wishes that she could have access to, the social worker or the psychologist in the building every day, just to sort of debrief and process, because she's crying out, what do I do with all of this? And we're getting better at providing the mental health support for students, but what is the mental health support for staff? And what is the mentality of the principals and the parents too? Because as parents, we can be really harsh on teachers, right? We gossip about them and we start saying, okay, well, you're in 3rd grade. Who's the good 3rd grade teacher? Oh, so-and-so can't control her class. And so the mindset again is this is a shared responsibility. They talk about that at Glasgow really well. It's not, this is your class and your child, and you are solely responsible for what they do when they walk down the hall, right? Just like in the video, your class didn't do this. It was everybody from the bus driver to the lunch worker. It was everybody's shared responsibility for how children were treated in the building and not judging other people and providing support for them. So kind of in summary, where this leaves us. So right now we're getting better, but I would say we really still have a lack of awareness and our understanding of the physical effects of trauma on the student, right? Then you add in things like the equity work of implicit bias, right? Deficits in cultural proficiency. When you start looking at some of the numbers, right? We know there's a equity part to this, and when you put the two together, you're starting to really compound your problem. And then we really have that framework of discipline and behavior that's meant to control and coerce, right? How do we get these kids through the institution throughout the day, which is very different from how do we build the skills and support the children and support each other to be successful. And then again, you add in things like the secondary trauma we just talked about, frequent misdiagnosis, and then here's kind of all the things that you can end up with. And so many of these things are the key issues that we're talking about, right? Absenteeism. Our work in the county, when we're talking about absenteeism, we have to be talking about trauma and ACEs with it. And again, maybe it's there, but I'm just not hearing it. And that's something that we need to really be aware of and watch for and advocate for, because we're not going to be effective. The schools that have been effective at working on their absentee problems, it's been from a culturally or from a trauma-informed lens. Test scores, achievement gap, and then of course your disproportionate rates of discipline, right, is what you're going to end up with. And these are, I don't know if you can see the titles, but I just wanted to pull some of these out. Again, work that's really specific on the intersection. So here you have, most of these are longer papers. They're like 8 to 10 pages, but they're really, really fabulous information that you could especially hand over to your principal or your school board member or your assistant superintendent. So race and trauma in the classroom, it's all right there. SEL, an equity lens, school discipline from an equity lens. And then this is the upper right-hand corner, talks about racial trauma, and it's a group here in Virginia. So it's nice and very specific. So, hurry on time. Let's look a little bit about what it means when we say trauma-informed schools. So, in a nutshell, it really starts with safety, right? We think, well, our schools are really safe, right? We have our SROs and we have all these procedures. That's not the kind of safety. It's important, but we're talking about emotional safety, physiological safety, right? A child who's experienced trauma might walk in this room right now and it might not feel safe for them, right? They're already elevated. They're already expecting danger to be around every corner. And instead of waiting for them to exhibit that through behavior, we know of a lot of things that we can do to proactively make them feel safe and get them settled. So safety is the big thing, respectful environment. That sounds so generic, but then again, when you think about the video, when you compare the two, think about what that really means when you start breaking it down and translating it, right? And then things like trust, building trust with your kid. If you're a child who's experiencing, again, abuse, neglect, extreme poverty, instability, chaos, they're not bound to trust anyone. That's something you have to really proactively work at. And we kind of take those things for granted. Well, that's not looking at it from a lens of a child who's experienced trauma. Oh, and so this, I put in too, just to kind of, if you were to say, what does this look like? And this is my son, he doesn't know that I'm doing this, so please don't tell him. But we did our little Christmas present, and I just wanted him, I said, you know, put something so the teachers know who it's from. And I didn't give him any specific instructions, and I just thought he put to Miss So-and-so from David. Well, he wrote these entire cards. And at Glasgow, they do something called Panther Time, where they do a lot of explicit learning. So you think by middle school, kids know the rules, they know how to do things. Well, they realize that a lot of kids either haven't developed those skills or haven't had successful opportunities to practice skills, or we have a lot of kids who are brand new to this country, brand new to this community, or you have kids that because of trauma are developmentally behind their chronological age. So they spend a lot of time talking about expectations and how to get through and be successful, and then that social-emotional learning concept. So again, I didn't tell him what to do or what to write. He wrote these whole cards, and he has you know, a lot of communication issues, processing issues. He can't really hold a conversation well. He doesn't normally talk like this, but he said, "Thank you for helping me and caring for me." That's not something he normally goes around saying, like, "Oh, my coach is so nice, he cares for me." Another one says, "Thank you for looking out for me." So if you want to know what this is when a child who has a PTSD diagnosis now is in 7th grade and on his own is thanking his teachers and saying, "Thank you for looking out for me," and can verbalize that. And then the other one says, "Thank you for always supporting me." So the official definition, the academic definition, is that there are 4 R's, 4 steps. Realize the impact of trauma, right? That's what we're trying to do right now, and make sure that just if we could at least make sure that everyone knows this information, and then being able to recognize the signs and symptoms, right? So that's when a child's refusing to do the work, refusing to come to school, or they're having behavior problems, they're having academic problems. You might be able to recognize, oh, let me think, could this be, let me evaluate in my mind, could this be trauma? And then you respond by integrating the knowledge and practices, and then actively resist re-traumatizing. And again, you would think that's a given, but there are so many things that are re-traumatizing to a child who's already experienced trauma, and so it's something that we don't want to overlook. And so again, understanding behavior and communication, students need to feel safe. And then the second bullet here, trauma-informed strategies benefit all students. We talked about that. And so this is really, because again, you can't get to these other things until the child feels safe, right? And again, that's not your interpretation of what's safe. It's their interpretation of what's safe. Then you can start to build on all of these other things. So sometimes when we start doing some of these wonderful programs or SEL programs or initiatives, that's great, but if we're jumping ahead on some of these steps or not understanding the felt safety needs of the child, and then we're wondering why maybe they're not as effective as we hoped, maybe we need to go back and really consider their emotional safety. And so this wanted to touch on too for this group. So this is from the new equity dashboard information. And so this is pulling out disruptive behavior. And so again, this is the framework, right? This is the system. What are we looking at? We're looking at, this is a coercion and control model, and we're measuring. It's getting better. We're working on it, but a lot of this in the past has been around what? Defiance, right? So, and even with our restraint and seclusion, being involved with that, heard from a lot of parents of kids going to a restraint seclusion situation for doing things like ripping up their paper, for talking back to the teacher. Okay, that is not, that is a framework of coercion and control. When you look at these kids, they are very defiant. They can be very disrespectful. They're very oppositional. But because they are in an elevated fight or flight mode all the time. They wake up that way. They spend 24 hours a day in that mode. And there are many ways to get beyond that if we're not so focused on keeping them in control and being compliant. So again, you say, what does this look like? These actually are not links. I just put these in. I can do them and resend them, but all of this is from Edutopia, which is an amazing site. And what I love about them is these are all little vignettes that are probably 3 to 5 minutes. So they're really easy and they're really digestible. But these are all examples of either a program or a strategy. So you have things like, so how do you build belonging in a classroom? Again, that's how do you establish that sense of safety right off the bat. Self-regulation with tone of voice. Whose is that? It's the teacher's tone of voice. There's so much of this that is the co-regulation and attunement, right? Because children attune themselves to the adults, and children who've experienced trauma have not been around healthy adults to experience healthy attunement. So that really puts the heat on the adults that they spend their time with during the day in our school buildings. Cultivating trust one-on-one. So again, trust is not just the, well, let's just spend time one-on-one. It's let's do it in a way where we're explicitly building trust. Belonging and classroom norms. Greetings at the door, that's now very common, and that's a very wonderful thing. A way to try to establish that safety for the minute that the students walk into the classroom. Movement breaks are very important, and then again, things like mindfulness can be very successful if they're done sort of within the right framework. And then there are a lot of other programs that are, when you see these programs, you can think trauma-informed, and a lot of these are happening in our schools. VTSS is our Virginia Tiered Systems of Support. So when you see these things, you can, your trauma-informed bells can start ringing, and you can think, hey, that's a good thing. But again, let's make sure in that framework of the 4 R's of being trauma-informed. And so this, again, is sort of where we're at here in Fairfax County, right? So Fairfax County has been, so FCPS has been doing a lot of training. The number is not on here, but through the Trauma Informed Community Network, I've been able to work really closely with Laura Tiemann, who's the senior social worker who does the professional development around trauma. So she can kind of keep me updated with the numbers. And I think now we're almost at 3,000 people who have done the FCPS Trauma 101, right? And that's fantastic. About 3,000 people, that's no easy feat. But we also have 25,000 employees. Of those, I don't know exactly how many are classroom teachers or school building staff, but a large percentage of them. So, and a lot of principals that I've talked to, they're like, it was a great training. We did it 3 years ago. I'm like, how many teachers are still in your building that were here when you did the training 3 years ago? I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. We need to do the training again because those teachers are no longer here. And the training is fantastic. It's an overview sort of the brain science. It doesn't have time to get into the strategies, right? Especially for teachers, those classroom strategies. And so that's an area that we could really improve on here in FCPS. Some other things to point out. So we do have, FCPS also has an academy class that goes into, so those are something teachers opt to do on their own and get credits for it, right? They get CEUs and it goes in their file and all those sorts of things. That's great. It's the Mind Up curriculum, which is a specific, actually Goldie Hawn's program. And so again, those are fantastic, but, and of course we have our school social workers and our school psychologists who can be very helpful to the principals. But what, if you were to ask me what I would like to see different, that would be for it to be driven more from principals, right? The schools that are doing it successfully, it's because the principals chose to do this, right? And we know that, and we hear Dr. Braybrand say this all the time, there's a lot of variation in our schools. Some schools are really running with things and other schools not. And we know probably as parents, because school A on one side of your neighborhood that is at a certain level and school B on the other side of your neighborhood that's really not so great, right? So we have a lot of consistency problems. We have, the principals have a lot of autonomy, which is great on one hand, but then on the other hand, you end up with this patchwork of something like trauma informed that should be so foundational, right? It should be for all of our students. And so if a particular principal has decided to really run with it, that's great. If you happen to know that, and if you happen to go to that school. If not, then, you know, your experience may vary. My other big ask would be, you know, student services really drives this, and it's fantastic because they're the clinicians who know this. But until this is embraced by the academic folks in our county, or through with our equity folks, and I have been talking with them and meeting with them and sharing this information and trying to kind of increase their awareness. They have a heavy lift with just the cultural proficiency piece, but it's such a natural hand-in-hand fit for this work to be with the equity folks and for them to really champion this. But I don't hear a lot from the assistant superintendents, from the executive principals. I don't hear them talking about this. And this is such an academic issue, right? If you want to get these kids through the SOLs, then you've got to be doing this stuff, right? The social workers are in the building how often, and they're in the IEP rooms, or they're testing. They're not there when the decisions are made. I don't think many principals are about to make a huge decision and say, wait, let me call my social worker and have them weigh in, right? That's not how it works. So we need to have these, the leadership more involved in this work and in these conversations. And I think if we could start to really go in that direction, we'd start to see a lot bigger results. Right now, like I said, we have some wonderful bits and pieces throughout the county, and we have teachers that have really embraced this. We have principals who have embraced this. I know all the school support staff have embraced this, but they're also just doing their day-to-day stuff. They're not available to really coach or assist the teachers as much as they would like to, and as much as would be beneficial. So, and then just to sort of wrap up, in terms of, I always hope that parents feel like this is something they want to push. So we want to talk about how to do that. And so the first thing is to just try to continue to learn more. If you think, well, what can I do? Just continue your own learning is very powerful. Especially there's so much now on social media that you can pick up on, and just be that armchair advocate where you're increasing awareness in your own circles and in your own schools using social media. We even have Oprah. She did a 60-minute segment, and so these are also things that you can send, to other people, right? So if you don't think they're going to read an article, maybe they'll watch a video, or maybe you can get them tuned in to sign up for an email newsletter by one of these groups, or follow them on social media. But Oprah did a 60 minutes segment on treating childhood trauma, and I bet you that's why people from South Africa were at this conference, because she said she changed her entire schools to be trauma informed. So, we don't have a lot of time to go into how to be trauma informed, but the thing is that I really want everybody to understand is that we don't have to figure this out. Other schools have already figured this out. Other school systems, other entire states, other entire countries have been doing this work. So we don't need to say, well, we are obviously a very large school district, but we don't need to recreate the wheel. This work has been out there for a long time. So these are some of the best resources for administrators or decision makers. Wisconsin, like I said, has made their entire Department of Public Education trauma informed, and they put the entire program online. So all their modules are there, all of their decision points, all of their analysis, it's all there. Again, you don't have to say, hey, principal, or hey, FCPS, I want you to do this. Good luck. All we have to do is follow what other people have been doing. Resources for teachers, same thing, right? This isn't easy. This is hard work, but there's some great information out there. These books really go into, especially the two in the corner, really talk about, well, what do you say in the moment? What do you say proactively? What do you say afterwards? How do you do this in your classroom? These things are available to us if we take advantage of them. And then resources for parents. All of these are great for all parents. Explosive Child is a little bit more specific if you have a child with high needs. But the rest of these, anything by Dan Siegel, is really going to help any parent understand how the child's brain works. If you've ever heard of flipping your lid, you want to learn what that is, it's a 5-minute thing. It really talks about building a positive relationship with your child and the importance of relationships.
Can you go back one?
And so as a PTA, you could buy one of these things for your school. You could say, hey, how about we have a PTA and staff book club? Again, you could do resilience together. There's all kinds of creative things that you could do with these resources. There's also something called ACES Connection. If you're interested, you can go and you set up just a profile and you can start getting information. Pretty much everything in the world related to ACEs and public health. There was an article they sent out the other day, that new study that looked at rates of asthma among African American men whose fathers were incarcerated. Very, very broad depth of information, but so you can sign up and pick what sort of information you want to get. And then different communities have a presence on this website. So again, in Fairfax County, we have the Trauma Informed Community Network. So you can go to ACES Connection and sort of sign up and see what's happening with the Trauma Informed Community Network. So this is a tremendous resource for people who are interested in this work. And then advocacy, so school-based, right? Again, ask about the training, and if it's, yeah, did that, well, how recently, and then what was the follow-up? You know, the trainings are important and the trainings are great, but what's the follow-up? What's the implementation? What's happening in the building? If you have an opportunity to select a new principal, we're going to be doing that now at Glasgow. These are some of the questions you could ask them. You know, are you aware of things like childhood trauma or ACEs? And if they're not, that's fine, but what's their willingness to learn these things? What are they signaling to you? Work with your PTA to do presentations. Ask for some of those specific programs. That could be a place to start. And then really you want to focus on, look at what's happening in your building around the discipline, right? Because that's going to be one of the key key indicators of how trauma informed your school is. And then really key people are your IEP case managers, because we know the relationship between the special ed students and trauma is very strong. Again, it could be somebody who's misdiagnosed or someone who has an IEP that's really more related to their behavior as opposed to other learning impairments. So people like your IEP case managers, if you had to really figure out where would we want to start in our building, people like that, your school security, the assistant principals who are really out working with the kids on a moment-to-moment level, they would be another great place to start with. And then here's a link. There's different assessments. This is a nice assessment because it talks about your readiness to be trauma informed, right? Because if you're saying, yeah, I want to be trauma informed, but that kid over there, Johnny's just a bad kid. Well, that's not really congruent with being successful in being trauma informed. And then at the district level, you can advocate to your school board member. And then, as we've talked about several times, is this part of the other conversations that we're having around equity, around absenteeism, around academic achievement? And then there's tremendous partners that are really wanting to work with us on this trauma informed. So the special ed community, you guys are on here that I talk about with other groups, mental health groups, child care groups. And then what I just talked about, advocate that the trauma-informed work must reside with instructional services as well as student services. Advocate for leadership voices. So a lot of other school systems are hiring someone to make their trauma-informed work. And that's something that we really just don't have here in Fairfax County. It just falls on other people. Talk about it when you have a seat at the table. And then really it's advocating for that mindset change. Okay. Man. And just real quickly, I do have my cards over here, but if you want to do some sort of follow-up, there's also the ACE presentation, and there's going to be a group of us that are going to get together and talk about some takeaways from the conference and then talk about that material more specifically. If you want to just give me your email, that means I'll just email you with some stuff that might, something where we might just get together, or I might just email you more stuff. If you're interested in that, just give me your email, and then, like I said, my email is over here on the card. And then just also quickly, I'll email this to you, Yvonne, but this is something specific to Virginia on how to become trauma informed. So this would be a great resource at your school. If you feel like your principal would really run with this, then let me know and I can get you a printed copy, but we don't have a ton of them. So otherwise, I can share the electronic copy with you guys. It's called Becoming a Trauma Responsive School, a guide for Virginia leaders. So this talks about what other school systems are doing. Fairfax County is not in here, which can think about what that means or doesn't mean, but it highlights what other school districts are doing. People who have like a trauma-informed position are doing, and then I was able to get my hands on it because I was interviewed as an advocate to have that family engagement piece, and then it has pretty much every resource you could ever want. But this was a group of doctoral students who were going to do a short paper on disproportionate disciplinary rates, and then once they started looking into it, it starts off with the figures. I mean, it's just so egregious of, the rates of special ed students, minority students, ESL students, and so it turned into the entire book of the way to address that is how to become trauma informed.
Yeah, hands.
I'm sorry, one question. You had a slide up there with a list of trauma informed programs, partner programs. Do you have like the links for those? It was just like the name.
Yeah, I'll double check that. The original presentation, when you hovered over the PDF, would have the link come up, but I have altered it quite a bit, so I'll double check that all the links are in there, and if not, I'll so don't send it out till I recheck it.
So I'm actually, as soon as he asked the question, I put back, and the links are there to all the resources.
Okay.
So again, I'll make sure that I send out the physical PowerPoint, not a PDF of the PowerPoint.
Yeah, it'll keep you busy. There's a lot of links in there.
So you had said earlier that you went through all of these different diagnoses and different doctors and going to different places, and then you finally realized it was that your son was trauma. So how did you go about figuring out what the exact trauma was?
Oh, I knew what it was,
Okay.
but I thought that because my son was so little, it wasn't affecting him. Yeah, it was not a mystery to me. But there are other things too that they're starting to look at that I don't know enough to really talk about, but medical trauma and even prenatal trauma. So parents who say, well, I don't really know what might have occurred in our home. It could be something like that. Or there's also types of intergenerational trauma, epigenetics, where the trauma is handed down. I mean, there's so many layers to it, but it's not always obvious, but at the same time, you don't want to assume that because a child is exhibiting certain things, that there's some hidden trauma that you don't know about. So I've had parents say, well, now, my child is this, so I think that means something bad happened to them that I don't know about. That's not the takeaway. And I promised Mike we would have all this discussion, and we didn't have time, and I'm sorry. I just was trying to remember my own material and get through it.
They don't wait, so I mean, there is time. We actually.
But I promised you we'd discuss it as we went, and then I realized that wasn't going you made me promise you like 3 different ways, so I'm sorry. He kept asking me, and I'm like, yeah, I got it. Discussion. And once I started, I was like, so.
You did good.
He tried.
No,
He tried.
No, that's a great.
Yeah.
And I'd be happy to come to your school and do something similar or resilience. And we also have the ACE interface program, which I thought I had the flyer, but maybe I can send that to you on too. That's another program in Fairfax County.
Okay, and I would like to get the recording and the PowerPoint out no later than 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Okay.
So if you make that priority, I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Little, do you want to put an exit ticket or not yet?
Could you put that back up?
Because I think, we'll get back to it. We'll get back to it, we're gonna go back. But just for, while we do have time, amongst yourselves, you can discuss, we go to the extra ticket. You know, the actions that you can take to increase your school trauma sensitivity. And I think a lot of that, what Jenna said, the action-based steps, you know, do not walk into your principal's office. Let's do all of these things this week. Can we do that, please?
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Think about a few things that might, even discuss amongst yourselves, whatever the dynamic is in relationship to the principal, how well you know them, how you after meeting, just take a few things in. And the first thing you should do is ask the principal, what do we have in place? Because there may be things in place you know about. Find what you have, maybe find out what they would like to have, and ways in close that gap in areas that the PTA or parents or with some other resources that can support that. Brother Joe.
Yeah, so what about on a governmental level that we can do to help increase Title I funding, to help bring this knowledge to politicians, you know, to try to get, if they keep knocking down on schools, knocking down on public schools, building up charter and choice schools, and this kind of thing, but really the public school system could work and is working in a lot of ways. So I think one thing we can do too, since we're such advocates for schools and for parents, is help find ways to help lead action to politicians, you know? So it's not just working on the school level, they also need more resources to it.
That's where PTAs, I think, in terms of advocacy, you know, there's advocacy day that takes place in January now. During December, we have a bunch of folks to meet with legislators, like so. So this would be a good time, that's a good time to bring that. You don't have to just use that time, you can kind of people all year round, but that's time that people try to get a large group of people. That's what it is.
Just a reminder, at your table, packets and your post-it notes and note cards, if you wouldn't mind recording some of your responses, and if you leave them on the front table by the sign-in sheet, and those will be compiled and will help inform the annual report for our upcoming your upcoming presentation.
So we can go back to the dates for our next meeting. The executive board session on March 3rd, which is a holiday. And March 3rd, yeah. So general session, our next meeting will be March 31st, and that's going to be focusing on changes to the student rights and responsibilities in the area of discipline. And I'm not sure of the name of the person who's coming to talk about it, but you'll get a separate communication. Carrie Williams. Okay. So having a discussion right now about the steps in terms of trauma sensitivity, but also looking ahead. And we'll have a communication sent out with this, specifically think of some questions that you have around that. We'll send the language, what the actual changes are, but so that you can come talk those questions. We had, you know, our December session for advanced academics, you know, so many questions, not enough time. So if we can make those questions in the presentation, it might answer a lot of them, you know, in advance. And again, how many other principals are here? I know one that's here. Cecilia Vanderheiden. I don't know if she did at the beginning. Thank you for coming out. Is there any other principals here? So I do want to, again, we're going to role play what we, I'm joking. How we, after our meetings, after our general meetings, you know, we schedule time. We go in our office and just talk about, you know, what was discussed, and we talk about what it looks like in the school and ways we can, I want to say address, it's not always a problem, but just ways to increase awareness, how we want to filter the information back out to the community. So Again, I'm not gonna go through everything on that action-based list, but we're gonna have some discussions around it. But depending on everybody's engagement with the principal is different. We hope through this committee and the work we do that it helps increase the engagement, but it may be emails, maybe a phone conversation, it may be a sit-down meeting, but make sure that you're connecting with the principal after these meetings to let them know about the information and ways that it can be, for, to your broader school community. And I think, and definitely invite them to come out, because I think every time they come out, they learn something, they get to hear perspectives, they share their perspectives. And time, 8:15, we're actually early, that never happens. I kind of don't know what to do, but we can talk amongst our tables about some ideas about trauma sensitivity. Jenna will be circulating to answer special questions.
So FCPTA has an advocacy night where all of the, what?
Say that for a meeting.
Oh, my bad. Maybe we can find it.
So now I'll know why 5 people are here.
Yeah.
What time is that?
Oh, yeah, I'll have an alternate there. I'll go do that. How about no fault?
It will be a good night to find
I'll let y'all know how it is. Let me get the, sorry.
Is it here at Gatehouse?
It's at the government center. It starts at 6:30. Yeah, so get a ticket. So start up. Yeah, so it's at the government center. It starts at 6:30. But all the Fairfax County only elected officials are there. Well, all of them have been invited. I don't know if they will.
But this is really good to bring up to the principals now, so that maybe they can send another representative. Well, we still have our meeting here, I don't think. All the other parents.
Yeah. Dan, we've kind of been following the theme and building up. We started off analyzing the survey, the family engagement survey, and to new members of the committee, talking about what the feedback is, how it differs from PTA, PTO, direct line to the school board, and the importance of having that voice. Survey being every 2 years, it also allows us to, in terms of our outreach and efforts, to the answers in certain areas on certain where it could be better. Then we had advanced academic discussion in December. We have a 2-part series on trauma informed. Now we're looking on discipline. So it's kind of all connected for student access, opportunity, health, well-being, and I will not commit to the draft numbers of but some ideas and concepts I think will just be reported now so the next meeting that we can start to organize around, because it's due to the school board mid-May, and being the spring break in April, and that's come back, it'll be a roller coaster down. So be on the lookout for that, and probably that there's certain takeaways that you have, future items that would be valuable in a report of the school board. Now we can talk about strategy. Can you put it back to the one, or whoever has the clicker, to the should I sit with you?
Here's what I do know. I'm fairly, I just didn't know about this. Somehow I didn't know. And so I went around here. And they use it all.
Because you don't want to back follow.
I think put there.
Yeah, I put it in Word, so I'm just gonna email it to you.
No.
I'm really
guys are probably you were gonna finish.
Yeah.
Like, I'm actually just because I work in pediatric research.
So we've been focusing.
Basically, these two guys ended up by sort of having to come together and doing this really large study on adverse experiences. They noticed that people who had
Yeah, so I have this as like, you know,
So like, I think it was the green color package, you said like.
We know this. I know that you guys.
snag this.
A lot needs a lot.
That is,
Right now?
And they just make that.
okay, yeah.
Hold on, Max.
Ready feedback.
Very quick.